Welcome to our 2130 Partners Operating Principle video series. I'm Suzanne Mayo-Frint, Principal of 2130 Partners, a leadership development and education firm, and co-author of our book, Accelerate, High Leverage Leadership for Today's World. This video segment is dedicated to operating principles, the first video segment in the series. So let's jump in. We define a principle as a basic premise guiding personal conduct. So operating principles taken together is a system of premises that guide our thinking, speaking, listening, and our actions. When practiced, these operating principles, when I practice them and incorporate them, then I become a much more productive, effective leader, manager, person. And when I practice these operating principles, it creates an opportunity for people around me to be much more productive. Let's explore how. In our book, Accelerate, High Leverage Leadership for Today's World, one of our premises is that we're facing an accelerated pace of change and more complex issues than ever before. So it requires a new way of thinking, a new model of thinking, an upgraded operating system, we could say. So if we compare the way our mental models have been in the past with a computer, we could say that the operating system could use some upgrading. So let's explore this analogy of a computer and an operating system and our brain and operating principles. So what we're saying is that the operating system of a computer, whether it's Windows, OS X, pick your operating system, actually enables the applications or enables the programs that are built to run on the operating system. And while you may buy a program for great parenting, how to be a stellar salesperson, leadership 3.0, or management science, any of the applications or programs that you might buy are enabled by or empowered by the operating system that they run on. And so while they have their own levels of effectiveness, to a certain extent they're either empowered or diminished by the effectiveness of the operating system. So when we translate that to our human brain, to our own mental models, what we're saying is that our way of operating, past-based way of operating, some of the thoughts and premises that we've had about leadership, about issues, about challenges, about people, could use a system upgrade. Then, any of the applications we might place on top of it, about stellar salesperson, great parent, exceptional leader, well, could all run much more effectively given this new platform. So our operating principles are a platform, they're an operating system upgrade that empowers and enables much greater effectiveness. So that's what the operating principles are. Let's take a look at how science is now, I think, validating some of the things that we've seen anecdotally for a couple of decades about human behavior and the way our thoughts impact what we do, and our actions and our speaking and our listening to other people impacts the way our real effectiveness. So there's an emerging field of social neuroscience that uses functional MRIs. So MRIs, magnetic resonance imaging, done while I'm doing some function. I could be eating my breakfast, walking down the street, working out, talking with another person, having an argument, having a great conversation, any of those things that I might be doing as a function while my brain is being imaged gives scientists a clue into what happens in the brain. If I'm hooked up to blood tests or those sorts of things, they can see what's happening in my chemistry when I'm performing those functions. So historically, those tests have been done, or those functional MRIs have been done on one person, one brain at a time. Well, now there have been some studies in this whole social neuroscience field of what happens to functional MRIs when two people are interacting. What happens to both of their brains? How their brains interlock? What happens to their mutual chemistry, their biology, and all those sorts of things. So I think you can tell I'm kind of fascinated by those studies. But what they tell us is what happens when that one person's interaction with another does impact the other person's chemistry, their biology, maybe even their immune system. So there are lessons from social neuroscience about that. If you'd like to learn more about that, Daniel Goleman has a book called Social Intelligence. After his book, he wrote Emotional Intelligence. So you can check that out. Another field of science that's curious and interesting about how we upgrade our mental operating system. There are some recent studies at the University of Pennsylvania on a field called brain priming. And so in these brain priming experiments, experiments, what they've done is actually primed someone's brain, had them think about or primed with certain kinds of thoughts, and see how their behavior, what happens with their behavior after they're brain primed. So to consider this experiment with two groups of people who are going to be going into a cafe to have lunch, groups of individuals who will be going into cafes to have lunch. The first group, they brain prime with ideas about time, all sorts of thoughts about, considerations about, consuming their thoughts about time. The other group, brain primed about money. So the first group goes into the cafe and they tend to either eat lunch together, find other people to socialize with, talk on the phone and socialize. They exhibit much more social behavior when their brain is primed with these thoughts about time. The other group that they brain primed about money, they tended to go into the cafe, eat alone, and work while they had lunch. So, you can make what you want out of those two different results. My main point is this whole study of brain priming shows that we can either be conscious about what is primed in our brains that then impacts our behavior, our thinking, our actions, our speaking, our listening, or we can be unconscious about it. So in our work, in 2130 Partners, we often use a metaphor of our brain as a file cabinet. So when you think about your brain as a file cabinet, as the historical records or the reference library of all of my experiences, my things that I've learned, the conclusions I've drawn, the judgments I've made, the biases I have, all of those things are stored in my file cabinet brain. So when I interact with another person, or I see something, or I hear something, what happens is I'm instantly and automatically in my file cabinet brain pulling out that file drawer, file folder, looking for my past-based information in my reference library to apply as a filter for this current situation. So can you see how our old operating system, or our historic operating system in any case, is not necessarily the most equipped to deal with the rapid pace of change, the complexity of issues we're facing today, new and unsolved issues? Perhaps it takes an upgrade to that operating system, not necessarily new stuff in it, but a new way to be able to be open and learning about what's right in front of us. So tie these pieces together, the science about what we've learned from social neuroscience, from the brain priming studies, from a number of other of these kinds of studies about what happens when we're instantly, automatically, and unexaminedly using information from our past-based, historical, biased, etc. file cabinet and layering that on. So versus a new way of interacting with our world in front of us. So how do our operating principles intervene and cause new interventions in this? So we're back to what about the operating principles after kind of moving through how the science talks about how we deal with things. So our operating principles help cause an intervention in using our brain, our file cabinet, as a reference library. It intervenes in that and consciously and purposefully brain primes or sets us up for with a mental framework that's much more productive and can accelerate our effectiveness. So instead of instantly and automatically accessing file cabinet, mapping it over to the current situation, we can shift to conscious and purposeful ways of being. And that the operating principles intervene in those automatic and instant ways of being so that we can allow ourselves to rapidly expand our adult learning and interacting capacities so we can really deal with the world and the people around us much more effectively. So, take on the operating principles, look at the video segments, practice them, incorporate them, integrate them into your way of being, see what happens around you. How am I a more effective component for productivity around me? What happens around me as a result of me taking on my own accountability for my own way of being? We call that self-generated accountability. What happens when I really take that on? So, let me give you a caveat about what operating principles are not. They're not a recipe for how to fly a plane. I don't recommend that you give these to your attorney about how to try a case in court. And while the coach of a sports team might be seen as being very humane in using these operating principles, they'd probably get fired right away. So these principles are to be used in our human interactions in areas where collaboration, creativity, connection, problem solving, opportunities, all of those sorts of things are what you're working on. So use these operating principles in most of our day-to-day and our business interactions. So, another caveat about operating principles. These are not things that you do to other people. So as you go through the 12 operating principles, it's not that someone else should take themselves lightly. It's not that someone else needs to listen newly. It's not that someone else is stuck in their file cabinet. These are all principles for me to apply to me, for my way of being, my way of thinking, my way of listening, my way of speaking, so that I can be a more productive and effective leader, parent, team member. So, use these principles, practice them, have them become a part of your life, and have them accelerate your leadership.